Landlords were enclosing fields and maximising profits. These were actions that required debt, and in ways that most likely wouldn't have been seen beforehand. But where did the money come from? To answer this question that we left off with in part 1, we have to examine the first British financial revolution. This transformation helped develop sophisticated markets, institutions and practices, enabling the British state and crucially those farmers to borrow unprecedented sums. It was built on an imported system that contemporaries called Dutch finance, yet the British found ways to adjust it to suit their own needs, and the use of the label has been open to debate. Either way, it started off with experimentation and ended in success, allowing the British to punch above their weight when it came to challenging their rivals overseas with the creation of the fiscal military state. However, the process was a lot more contentious than people may have realised. Bitter clashes within the ruling class occurred, and a heavy toll was placed on the poor. The burden of servicing capital with this colossal state apparatus fell disproportionately upon the labouring masses through aggressive, coercive and expropriatory practices. We'll explore this in 5 ways, with looking at 1. The dating of the revolution, 2. The pre-revolution economy, 3. The mechanisms of expansion, 4. The social toll, and 5. Further historiographical debate. Traditionally, the dating of the financial revolution rested on the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which William III of the Netherlands took over England with the help of his wife and with the support of the nobility to prevent James II from establishing a Catholic dynasty. When William III took the throne, he was said to have imported the practices of Dutch finance. The 1688 date is particularly promoted by historians Douglas North and Barry Weingast in their 1989 paper. They focus on how, because Parliament now more firmly controlled the king, the government could be trusted to actually pay back its debts, making massive borrowing possible. However, later works by other historians have come to challenge this, saying that developments came about a lot earlier. For example, by the mid-17th century, London's goldsmith bankers had already established a sophisticated fractional reserve banking system. What I mean by fractional reserve banking is the practice of holding only actually a fraction of customer deposits in bank balances, whilst the remainder can be lent out, all for the purposes of incentivizing further lending and creating a money multiplier effect. Some historians such as Gregory Clark actually try to go even further back, suggesting that changes had already started from the 16th century during the Tudor period, and that the private economy in England after 1540 was largely insulated from political events, even from the strife of the Civil War. Clark here used the Charity Commission to prove that a lot of this, looking at nearly 3,000 farmland transactions between 1540 and 1837, finds out that real land values were raising at a rate of 0.6% to 0.8% per year before 1688. Ironically, it was actually after the Glorious Revolution in the long term that saw a 9.7% decline in land values, showing how the whole process of this transformation was a lot more volatile to the country than initially thought. However, it's worth noting the relationship between private and public finance, but the latter type of finance is where the revolution's changes rest. The only skepticism I have of Clark is pushing back development to the Tudors as a result of not understanding this distinction. At that point in time, public finance had yet to catch up with private finance. So, with the medieval label, which is often associated with finance at large at this point in time, it certainly wasn't the case for private finance necessarily due to its developments of early capitalism, but that there is a valid use for it when it comes to engagement by the Stuarts and public finance. So overall, rather than looking for a single fixed year to pinpoint the revolution, as well as looking at it from public finance, we should view this similarly to how we viewed the agricultural revolution, a profound structural transformation that transformed broadly across the 17th century and into the 18th century. Speaking of public finances, it was characterised as medieval because the monarchies operated under the traditional expectation that they should live on their own through royal estate revenues and prerogative rights. Parliament was the only way you could acquire revenue outside what the monarch personally owned. But during the 17th century, there were increasing problems with deficits due to a lot of wars that England engaged in. As a result, James I and Charles I resorted to a series of arbitrary and extra-parliamentary methods of revenue extraction, such as liquidating 25% of crown lands and selling off hereditary titles. In fact, James I literally invented a brand new hereditary title, the baronet, in 1611 specifically for the purpose of selling it for cash to fund the military in Ireland. Even then, it still wasn't enough, and so they began to engage in even more risky and coercive methods. Ironically, Parliament withheld funds in an attempt to force the Crown to accept institutional limits, which inadvertently worsened the Crown's fiscal problems and intensified its aggressive search for alternative extra-parliamentary revenues. There were two particular methods that the monarchs used when this began happening, with the first being forced loans and the second being various other prerogative loopholes. With the forced loans, they were extracted from unwilling subjects 4 separate times, and the Crown rarely honoured the agreements of repaying the principal, or you can call the initial sum borrowed. They did this while unilaterally demanding to be able to continually renew these loans or lower the interest rates, a practice that destroyed its reputation among moneyed interests. Meanwhile, with the prerogative loopholes, this came in a range of ways such as 1. Selling monopoly patents, 2. Reviving obsolete regulations to extract fines, 3. Exploiting the court of wards, so courts for estates who were run by minors, to drain their estates of wealth, 4. Utilising purveyance to seize goods at below market prices, and 5. Establishing ship money during peacetime, extending it inland so it wasn't just paid by the coastal provinces. The problem wasn't just the monarch, it was the machinery of the state itself. At this point, it lacked a centralised bureaucratic apparatus for tax collection, instead relying on tax farming, so the practice of auctioning the right to collect taxes to private individuals or groups. This provided immediate credit, but severely limited the government's fiscal control and flexibility. You can understand this as, whilst the revenue from customs grew over time due to increasing trade, the Crown saw almost none of that because the tax farmers kept nearly all of the surplus. This was made all the more difficult as the Crown had to repeatedly undertake a cumbersome process of renegotiating the farmers' leases with the system. It wasn't until under Cromwell and the later Stuart monarchs that efforts were made to abandon this practice and to centralise finances. Yet, even this granted limited results, and it remained constrained to borrowing small amounts of short-term debt at exorbitant interest rates ranging from 6 to 30%. It got so bad that it culminated in Charles II's partial repudiation of over £1 million of debt in 1672, known as the Stop of the Exchequer. This event is especially important with what was created out of it, which we will get into later. Overall, due to the limited capabilities of the administration to handle finances sufficiently, it meant relying quite a bit on private finance. It became increasingly clear how easy it was to abuse and how it just wouldn't cut it for the developing world at this point in time. Soon enough, things would begin to drastically change with the peak of the revolution, characterised into 2 phases, one of initial further turbulence, to then one of stabilisation as we go through the 18th century. The earlier phase that was characterised by initial turbulence was also characterised by experimentation and the outlining of the parameters of new practices put into place. For starters, Parliament didn't just retain its power over taxes, it gained exclusive control in auditing government expenditures. This effectively stripped the monarch of the power to arbitrarily expropriate wealth or default on loans. The abolition of prerogative courts and the guarantee of an independent judiciary allowed for the effective enforcement of this and made clear the power and limitations of the 3 branches of government. Outside of the political changes, getting into the vital financial reforms themselves, changes were made to debt, taxation, banking, currency, and property legality. With relation to debt, the shift happened in 2 ways. Firstly, it shifted things from royal debt to national debt. Secondly, it moved away from short-term, coercive borrowing with the former to long-term, funded debt with the latter. This was to help start legally enforcing the practice of systematic revenue recording from newly authorised taxes to guarantee the interest payments on each new loan issued. Although it was still highly expensive initially, as they relied on a form of loans called irredeemable fixed-term annuities. They were loan obligations that you have to pay back with a fixed amount of time given them to do so, and to which cannot be further exchanged, reversed or cancelled, essentially locking the government into exorbitant interest rates. To resolve this, administrations engaged in further debt restructuring, most notably using the South Sea Company in 1711 and 1719 to 1720. It did so by inducing creditors to voluntarily exchange these high-interest annuities for corporate stock. While the infamous South Sea Bubble of 1720 ended in a catastrophic market crash, the attempt provided the government with the necessary blueprint for handling massive debt conversions. This would culminate in the later phase with the administration of Henry Pelham in the 1750s, allowing him to reduce interest rates and to consolidate the state's obligations into highly liquid perpetual 3% consols or consolidated annuities. Meanwhile, with taxes, the Treasury Board began implementing rigorous bookkeeping and demanding regular accounts from all spending departments. These actions allowed the government to shift the tax burden away from direct land taxes toward highly lucrative indirect taxes, namely customs and excises. For those who may not know, customs are taxes on goods imported into the country, whilst excises are taxes on goods made domestically. The latter in particular, under the Excise Office, began to be known for its bureaucratic efficiency, utilising highly trained, specialised gaugers and supervisors who operated under strict internal discipline. Though, to crucially note, this change to tax types didn't happen overnight. Direct taxes were still vital, especially during the 9 Years' War against France, providing 42% of all tax revenue and peaking at 52% in 1696. It was like this because it was administered by local gentry rather than a royal bureaucracy, thereby keeping the executive branch strictly dependent on the legislature. The decisive shift towards the highly lucrative indirect customs and excises only occurred after the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, driven by the permanent necessity of servicing the massive new long-term debt. As for banking and currency, the state chartered massive joint stock corporations to intermediate its borrowing, as well as, of course, the most important entity that came out of the aforementioned stop of the Exchequer and the 9 Years' War, the Bank of England. Being established in 1694, it interestingly didn't follow the Dutch model of a 100% reserve bank that was maintained largely by individual cities. Instead, England began implementing a more nationalised version of what has already been discussed with goldsmiths, being a fractional reserve banking network. As a result of this, English banks had more flexible liquidity with capital, and this led to them becoming increasingly enticing to the Dutch. Dutch holdings in Bank of England stocks amounted to nearly 20% of new purchases by the mid-1720s. Now having the capacity to aggressively expand domestic credit supply, recoinage occurred in 1696, and Isaac Newton's 1717 valuation of the guinea placed Britain on the gold standard, minimising exchange rate risks in international capital movements. That would have been very important with the empire making that Britain was doing at this point in time and ramping up. To also make a note, it crucially would have prevented a return to royal absolutism, or at least an attempt at that form. After all, it made it so that the bank could act as an entity to legally prohibit lending money to the crown without explicit parliamentary consent. The changes that have been outlined affected not just the finances of the state, but the myriad of groups that lived within British society. Starting with finances, it allowed Britain to mobilise what it needed in a way that outstripped its rivals. On the eve of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, annual government expenditures stood at approximately £1.8 million, while the national debt was roughly £1 million, representing merely 2 to 3% of the estimated national income at the time. This debt then climbed to a whopping £133 million by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, just 80 years later. This would have been absolutely impossible to service at such a scale if it was before the changes that were introduced. Even so, to be able to afford this, taxes alone couldn't cover it. Taxes grew sixfold between the reign of Charles II and the 1780s, rising from an annual average of £3.64 million to over £12 million. But the cost of servicing the debt frequently exceeded 40% of its tax income for half the years between 1713 and 1785, reaching a peak of 66% by the end of the American War of Independence. The fiscal military state had been born. But the most interesting developments that came about was the class conflict and who benefited and disadvantaged from it. Firstly, there were the traditional landowners who reacted with initial bitter hostility. They bore the brunt of much of the financial revolution, as the state relied heavily on direct land tax, which provided 42% of all tax revenue during the 9 Years' War and up to 52% in the single year of 1696. Prominent figures like Viscount Bolingbroke complained that the landed men had been impoverished to fund foreign wars, while a new class of financiers became their masters. However, these landed elites successfully adapted as the revolution progressed. With this, they could have most likely begun to tackle the debt they engaged with in the agricultural sphere. They shifted the tax burden by refusing to update the 1692 land valuation, meaning their tax incidence actually fell as agricultural rents rose. Furthermore, landowners increasingly invested their own savings into government stock and utilised the massive expansion of the state's military and civil administration to secure salaried offices and commissions for their younger sons. With the individuals who benefited the most out of this, however, these were the ever-emerging bourgeoisie. Men like Samuel Fludyer and Sampson Gideon accumulated wealth approaching £1 million by underwriting government loans and provisioning troops. The landowning elites still held hostility even as they tried to adapt. They viewed these financiers as parasites who harvested wealth from the plunder of their country and who manipulated the stock market to the detriment of honest trade and agriculture. Country ideology, which championed the independent landed proprietor and viewed the financier, the stock jobber and the standing army as these inherently corrupting forces, remained the dominant political discourse of the age. As we discussed in the Agricultural Revolution video, the old landed elites were focused on lavish spending and traditional prestige. At this point, the bourgeoisie wasn't necessarily supplanting the landed aristocracy to a significant degree, as that happened much later. There's some argumentation in the sources that say there was some blurring of the lines distinguishing between the two classes. For example, Brewer cites Josiah Tucker to say that they weren't actually divided all that much, and the landowners increasingly diversified their income by investing in government stock, with over 60,000 public fund holders by the 1760s, many of whom were provincial gentry. Yet, that animosity remained, and it was incredibly fierce and politicised. I think it is far more likely, based on what has already been provided, that even if there was some integration that occurred, there was a fight for control, particularly an understanding of the two of them competing in the first place. As historian Geoffrey Holmes notes, to many in the landed interest, it seemed monstrous that the Londoners, whose new riches were giving them access to political influence, should evade both heavy taxation and social responsibilities which an extensive landed estate incurred. To note as well, this animosity was also fueled by social snobbery, xenophobia, and religious prejudice, as many prominent financiers were dissenters, Huguenots, or of Jewish or Dutch extraction. However, as you know with the theme of these videos, for the lower classes and the average labouring person, the effects were mixed to say the least. Actually, that's putting it lightly, it was overwhelmingly oppressive in this instance, more apparently so than even in the agricultural revolution. Remember the shift from direct taxes to indirect taxes? Because indirect taxes were levied on customs and excises, basic everyday commodities such as beer, salt, soap, candles, leather, and coal began increasing in price. Producers and distributors immediately passed the cost of these excise duties down to the consumer, creating a regressive tax system. The raw data on consumer prices illustrates this starkly. Following the imposition of new duties in the 1690s, the price of salt more than doubled. Candle prices increased by 20% by 1710 to 1711, and the wholesale price of a barrel of beer jumped by 26% during the 7 Years' War. To add on, the state's insatiable demand for military manpower led to the violent expropriation of their labour. The army relied on impressment commissioners who explicitly targeted the poor, the friendless, and those without any lawful calling or employment, sweeping them into the ranks. For seafaring men, the naval press gang was a constant and bloody terror, with the lower classes increasingly viewing the state as an intrusive policing force. The expanding excise bureaucracy placed petty tyrants in every town and hamlet to rigorously monitor production, an intrusion heavily resented by local artisans and retailers. When the lower classes attempted to resist these economic hardships through grain riots, anti-turnpike demonstrations, or anti-enclosure protests, they were met by the peacetime standing army, which functioned as a domestic police force. These frequently ended in civilian fatalities, such as the 21 people killed during the Hexham militia riots in 1759, or the estimated 285 dead during the Gordon riots of 1780. Douglas North and Barry Weingast are the two of the most prominent economic historians who discuss the financial revolution and its relationship to the 1688 Glorious Revolution. They are famous in particular for their credible commitment thesis. They argue that because the Glorious Revolution affirmed parliamentary supremacy, the Crown could no longer abuse its financial power, making the government a credible, trustworthy borrower. Now, whilst it is valid to say it helps towards preventing future extortion from the Crown, there are significant caveats to this, especially with it overstating the immediate macroeconomic benefits of the institutional reform, but more importantly, its supposed effects on private property rights and returns. We already touched on earlier regarding historian Gregory Clark on private returns on land and capital, but it is interesting to note with Sussman and Yaffe being able to corroborate this failure of the credible commitment theory as a matter of fact, demonstrating that Britain actually didn't borrow at significantly lower rates than autocratic European monarchies with supposedly inferior property protections such as with Austria. It's actually better to say that war and conflict contributed to finance more, particularly towards Clark mentioning the decline in land value long term due to the perceived insecurity of things like the Jacobite rebellions. Not only was this the case, but Julian Hoppit shows this argument is a bit of an anachronistic view of the state. It completely ignores the fact that parliamentary supremacy granted the legislature absolute authority to compel the alienation of property. Capitalist development was routinely reliant on influencing legislation, authorising the expropriation of private property, whilst with compensation decided by local juries to facilitate infrastructural and commercial developments. It paved the way for well-known things like turnpikes, canals, and docks, which became synonymous with the Industrial Revolution. So in actuality, it made property rights less secure, ironically. Rather than there being this absolute security of property rights as envisioned by North and Weingast, it was actually the flexibility and expanded capacity of property to be aggressively alienated for the public good that helped Britain's economy. Finally, there is this debate over the exact origins of public finance. We mentioned earlier this idea of Dutch finance having been brought over to England. It rests on the idea that even if England has a sophisticated banking network, the traditional narrative is that importing Dutch finance was a vital catalyst that centralised the system. Already casting doubt due to the fact of how the Dutch financial system worked in the first place, it gets into the argument held between PGM Dixon and Marjolein de Hart. Dixon advocated for the Dutch finance narrative, whilst de Hart questioned whether it was the devil or the Dutch that drove the financial revolution. With the wars that have already been highlighted in this video, de Hart focuses on saying that those wars, on top of prior changes in developments under Cromwell and Charles II, were far more responsible for the institutionalisation of funded debt than mere Dutch imitation. The first British financial revolution was not an overnight phenomenon sparked by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was a centuries-long structural transformation. It rescued the British state from the inadequacies of royal finance, expanding its capacity to wage war, extract revenue, and absorb massive debt. It ultimately did help Britain move away from its issues that were brought about from the powers of the Crown and the poor banking, debt structuring, taxing and currency systems that were in place. The state massively expanded its capacity to engage in war. Britain didn't merely copy Dutch finance, it weaponized it for its own imperial needs and developed it in its own ways. This transformation sparked bitter conflict. While landowners and the rising bourgeoisie vied for dominance, they ultimately found ways to mutually benefit to some capacity, which exposed a glaring hypocrisy. The state championed the sanctity of private property whilst routinely violating it to serve moneyed interests. It were the labouring masses that suffered the most as a result from regressive taxation, impressment, and a state eager to crush any economic dissent. But, faced with this increasingly expensive reality, the British working classes adapted. To survive the rising costs of basic goods, and to grasp at the new consumer comforts flowing into the country that they might have desired, they fundamentally changed how they lived and worked, something crucial for consumer patterns in capitalism. That shift in human labour and household survival is what we will explore in the next video, the Industrious Revolution.